Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Ross. I'm the publisher of woodcentral.com.au, one of the world's largest platforms for timber-based news. And today I'm joined by Rod Wiles, who has worked for the American Hardwood Export Council since 1999, when he helped to assist the European director in the London office. He was in Singapore from 2010 to 2018 and is now based in Dubai in the UAE, from which he is responsible for directing AHEC's programs in Africa, the Middle East, India, Australia, and of course, New Zealand. Whilst assisting in running the activities in Western Europe, he was responsible for expanding AHEC's programs to Central and Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, and then on to India, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Over the years, Rod has built up a wealth of knowledge on the global market for wood products and has developed a specialist skill in international promotions of hardwood products. Rod, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jason. It's good to be here.
Rod, can you tell us a bit about AHEC and some of the work that you guys do around the world?
So AHEC is, for some people, when they first hear about it, it's actually quite difficult to understand what we do. And the most important thing to say from the get-go is that we don't sell anything. So AHEC is, in America, a non-profit trade association representing all of the major exporters of American hardwood products to all over the world. Our role overseas with AHEC is the promotion of American hardwoods in export markets. Promotion, education, hopefully inspiration as well. So we do all sorts of different activities, whether it's from a trade show where we take our members from the US to trade shows around the world, where they can actually sell their products. Or we get involved in design collaborations with architects and interior designers, furniture designers. We do seminars to architects. We do seminars, educational seminars to people in the industry as well. And we also just keep on top of what's going on in the trade in hardwoods around the world. So it's an information flow as well as everything else.
Well, can you tell us a bit about some of the American hardwood species?
America, there's about 20 plus commercial species that come out of the US. And there's probably sort of 10 that really dominate in terms of production and trade around the world. So we're looking at red and white oak, walnut, cherry, ash, hard and soft maple, tulip wood. Those are probably the main species come out of the US. Some of them are completely unique to the United States. Some of them have been planted elsewhere in the world and now they grow there as well. But American hardwoods do differ from hardwoods from many other parts of the world. There are some similarities with what's coming out of Europe, but nothing is quite the same. So, it's a fairly unique proposition.
Are they primarily on the east coast of the United States, or is there some in the west coast as well, on the Midwest region?
So the vast majority of the mixed hardwood forests of the United States down the eastern side. So it's right from the top right-hand corner to the bottom right-hand corner, east of the Mississippi, sort of. And the real sort of breadbasket for production is the Appalachian region. So, you're looking at different topography there. Lots of different species. That's known as the breadbasket of the American hardwood industry. But then there's also a pocket of growth of American hardwoods up in the northwest corner of the United States, where some species grow there that don't grow anywhere else in the country.
What's the rotation work in terms of harvesting of the hardwoods?
Well, it's very different to. I mean, we're talking about a natural forest that's mixed age, mixed species. This is not a planted forest at all. So we don't really talk about rotation. Rotation is a term that we use when we're talking about plantation. We're talking about natural regeneration. So I suppose you would say that the average age of a tree being felled in the forest is something like 80 years. But what we do is selective or selection harvesting. So you would go into a tract of forest, you would remove, one over here, one over here. There's the right age, the right species. You take those out with minimal disturbance to the rest of the forest. And then you'd walk away and you'd leave it. And you leave the young trees that are all ready to grow, you leave them to grow back. So again, we don't talk about rotation in a way that we would when we were planting a single species in a plantation. American hardwoods are not replanted, they're naturally regenerating. So it's just a process of harvesting less than is growing walking away and leaving it alone and letting the natural forest do its thing.
And that's an important distinction, isn't it? Because you're actually it's growing, isn't it? The hardwood area of forest. It's actually growing. It's not actually declining. It's getting stronger. It's getting richer. Is that correct, Rod?
It's absolutely correct. I mean, the forest area itself is increasing in size all the time, which is astonishing when you consider that, we're using American hardwoods now more than ever before. But the forest area is growing, and that's partly because there's increased urbanization. So there's people are moving away from the country into cities, etc., and the trees grow back. That's what they do. And a really good way of sort of summing that up is to look back at 150 years or so ago, where in some states in the eastern part of the United States, particularly Pennsylvania, the first sort of settlers who came to the United States or came to America, they found this wonderful resource. They needed the wood for everything. So they made a pretty good job of cutting it all down, and they also needed to create space to farm. And so, by about the end of the 19th century, you were looking at areas that were just completely devoid of any trees at all. And then people started moving further west, where the land was more fertile for farming. There was less forest in the Midwestern parts of the United States, and they left these areas alone. And in the space of 70 years or so, those trees grew back. So we have really mature, healthy, rich forests in states like Pennsylvania that have recovered over a period of 70 years. So this is what happens when you walk away, you leave it alone, it grows back. And on top of that, we're also harvesting much, much less than is growing. And actually, if you look at our website, there's an interactive map that shows you all the levels of harvest and growth across all the states, by species, even down to sort of almost county level as well. And we also look at the speed of regeneration of a particular species, which is fascinating and quite difficult to get your head around. But, we know that it takes 0.57 seconds for 1 cubic meter of red oak to grow back in the forest, which is extraordinary. People say, well, this is ridiculous. It grows far too fast. I say, no, but hang on. There's a lot of this stuff growing all the time.
Yeah.
So every time we do a project, we do a collaboration with designers, one of the things we look at is how much wood was used to make that chair or that piece of furniture, whatever it was. And say, okay, well, it took 1 cubic meter to make that. And then we look at all the wastage, the full life cycle, etc. But one of the most interesting things to say is, yeah, you do realize that the wood we used to make those chairs grew back in the forest in less than a second. And that's a really, really interesting way of looking at it. Yeah.
The ultimate renewable resource, right?
It is. And actually, also people say to me, well, that's great. We have this wonderful renewable resource. Fantastic. It grows back. But should we really be shipping it all the way around the world? And especially to a place like Australia, it's a hell of a long way from the United States. Surely this is really bad news. So, well, actually, transport on ships is really, really efficient in terms of CO2 per kilogram of product on that ship. And actually, we can say that American hardwood lumber shipped anywhere in the world on arrival in the destination port is actually carbon negative. In other words, there was more CO2 locked in the tree, in the wood itself, than was emitted in all the processes of getting it to that port. What happens when it arrives in Sydney or Brisbane or Melbourne after then is up to, the manufacturer, et cetera, in Australia. And actually, the interesting thing there is that road transport is terrible. So, that's really where it gets interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Rod, because there's been a lot of research looking at sustainable fuels, for example, for shipping as well. So the decarbonization of shipping, and also, looking at, for example, airline transport as well. Really, it's very compelling to actually export, and also in terms of getting the product from America through to the Asia Pacific. I imagine it would be quite a seamless process as well.
Of course, when we're shipping American hardwood lumber around the world, which has been kiln dried, it is put in containers. So this isn't going break bulk on a ship, a big ship full of wood, etc. It's mixed on a container with many other containers on board a ship. It is a very efficient way of doing it. And the other efficient thing is actually the kiln drying process in America, because a lot of the energy that's needed to operate these kilns is derived from biomass from the sawmill itself. So it could be from wood chip and sawdust, could be from solar. So actually, that's a fairly low energy consuming process as well. So the whole cycle of the production of American hardwoods, from extraction in the forest through to arrival in destination port, it's low embodied energy. It's a really low carbon process.
You mentioned before the amount of the volume of hardwood, for example, that's through India, China, Australia. It's actually interesting looking at the data that it seems that a higher portion of American hardwoods is now actually being exported to those countries. Is there a reason why those particular countries are consuming more American hardwoods?
Because we're doing a good job. No, no, it's well, as I said at the beginning, American hardwoods offer a unique prospect, and one thing they offer is really, really high quality and consistency in quality and consistency in supply. So if you are a manufacturer that's putting a lot of wood through a constant production process, producing furniture, whatever it may be, for export to another country around the world, you're going to need something that is consistently available, of the right quality. It all looks more or less the same, so that you can deliver, the same chairs looking the same all the time. And that's where American hardwoods really sort of plug into that sort of big production cycle. So these countries that you mentioned, there's Southeast Asia, there's India, these places, those industries, those big furniture industries, particularly those that are export focused, are developing. India in particular, we're moving from a very unorganized furniture sector to a more organized sector. There's still a hell of a long way to go in India. And, that market offers enormous potential for American hardwoods over the long term. And then you have countries like Vietnam, etc., that are making masses of furniture and exporting it all over the world. And that's actually increasing all the time. To Australia, it's quite interesting because Australia isn't a big producer of furniture for export. In fact, Australia isn't a big producer of furniture. It's a big importer of furniture. Yeah. Production costs in Australia, labor costs are extremely high. But what we're seeing in Australia is a really interesting, well, there's two things. One of them actually has nothing to do with us or our industry. It's the wine industry. And of course, the wine industry relies on oak, and it needs to be white oak, whether it's European or American, for aging wine. So Australia does buy a lot of fairly low-grade lumber to turn into various aging products like tank staves that gets inserted into these sort of steel tanks, for aging the wine. And we really don't know how much of the volume of American hardwood lumber that is exported to Australia is actually accounted for by that side of things, possibly a third or so. However, what we have seen over the last year to 2 years has been a really, really big jump in the exports of American red oak lumber to Australia. And that's been really, really encouraging. And that's mainly a response to needing to fill the gap in the local supply of hardwoods in Australia, in particular Victorian ash. And American red oak does seem to fit in very well to that in terms of application, etc.
Yes, and in fact, compared to a lot of Latin American species, for example, it's probably a better fit, isn't it, in terms of its density of the timbers as well, and the coloring as well.
Color, available, again, that consistency of supply as well. So, well, we always know it's going to be available. We always know that the quality is going to be this, the color is going to be this. It's that sort of reliability. And yes, in terms of application, I mean, it pretty much does everything the Victorian ash will do. So it's a great fit, and it's really encouraging for the American hardwood industry, because red oak is the #1 species in the forest. So it's important that we find as many outlets for red oak as possible. We can't just focus on using white oak or walnut, for example. I mean, walnut is actually around 1% of the of the forest in the United States, only 1%. That doesn't mean there isn't enough walnut to go around or that walnut is running out in any way, but we need to be responsible about how we use the resource itself, and we should use it in proportion to what's available in the forest in terms of species.
I think that's an important distinction, that concept of finding a home for the tree as well. I think that's really, and the highest value product is really important.
It is important. I mean, one thing the United Nations said about 15 years ago or so was that the greatest threat to the American hardwood forest was actually lack of use. It was
Yeah.
being underused. So if it's not used enough and valued as a productive forest, from which you take, hardwood lumber for products or hardwood veneers, then you might as well turn it to something else. And this is a big problem, and this has happened all over the world. I mean, we've seen in many parts of Southeast Asia, we've seen natural forests being converted to rubber plantation or to oil palm plantation because the forest itself wasn't as valuable. Well, let's make sure that the American hardwood forest is extremely valuable for what it is and what it provides. Let's manage it so that it's really productive. But at the same time, let's make sure it's we're dealing with natural regeneration. There's huge biodiversity in the forest, but we must use it responsibly. We must say, okay, well, red oak is roughly 18% of the forest volume. So let's make sure that we're producing, our production is around 18% accounted for by red oak. And let's try to do that and try and keep it well balanced.
Do you find that there's been a push towards creating engineered wood products out of American hardwoods?
There has, and it's a really interesting space to sort of be in now. There's a huge renaissance in wood around the world, and of course mass timber for construction, and it's really interesting. I mean, we are under no illusion that American hardwoods are going to jump into that space and take over in terms of glulam and cross-laminated timber, et cetera, et cetera. No, they're not. Of course, no, they're not. This really is the realm of softwoods. However, there are some niche opportunities for American hardwoods in these products, and we've actually seen some commercial applications of American hardwood mass timber. Australia is a great example. You have the biggest mass timber producer in the Southern Hemisphere, which is now using red oak to make glulam products, which is extraordinary. And actually, they're way ahead of what's going on in Europe. In terms of those products. We've also done some tulip wood CLT test projects in Europe. And actually, there's been one or two commercial applications of tulip wood CLT as well. And they're interesting because, and this is where it gets a little bit technical for me, to be perfectly honest, but, what we're dealing with in terms of hardwoods and softwoods is hardwoods much, much stronger than softwoods. So for CLT made out of tulip wood, you need much less wood, much less material to make a panel that is just as strong. So you may only need, say, 5 layers of tulip wood in a CLT panel rather than 7 for a softwood panel, as tulip wood is roughly 3 times stronger in terms of rolling shear. And of course, the same goes for red oak in glulam. It's going to be much stronger than some softwood products in glulam as well. And actually, there's some examples, even in Europe, of American hardwoods in glulam. There's a fantastic example at Lord's Cricket Ground in London. It was Populous Architects. They did these incredible white oak glulam beams that they're actually outdoors. They support this shade structure over the Warner stand. And I think these beams are something like 20 meters long, and they're 3 meters deep in the middle. I mean, they're enormous, great things. So there are opportunities out there. There's a lot of interest, and it's something that we need to keep on top of and look at for opportunities. I mean, the American hardwood industry needs to find as many opportunities as possible for its products.
If, for example, you would love, if you're an architect or a designer, interior designer that would love to collaborate with AHEC, how do you get in contact, and how do you look at potentially collaborating on select pieces?
So the collaborations that we do, they always actually start with us. It's not really people coming to us saying, "Hey, would you like to work with us?" We tend to come up with an idea and then reach out to people. and do it that way. And what we've done in Australia over the last 10 years and more is, we've sort of picked various designers that we like their work. We like them as well as individuals. It's important to work with people you like. And we said, hey, how about we give you this brief, you work with us, you make this piece, or we have this piece made that you design, and we'll show it for you in some exhibition. And so we took part in Den Fair 3 or 4 times, I'm not sure, when that was running in Melbourne. We've taken part in Sydney Design Week, in Melbourne Design Week, and we're planning to be in Melbourne Design Week again next year as well. We're working on a project at the moment with 6 really well-known Australian architects. And that's interesting as well. We're challenging architects to design a piece of furniture, which is a challenge. And of course, then we also need to get involved in a sort of mentoring capacity as well, because, you need to understand what you're doing when you're designing with wood. So often we bring design mentors in. We've done projects where we get Australian architects and designers in a mentoring capacity. Adam Markowitz, who's a Melbourne-based architect, furniture designer and maker, has been a mentor on a number of projects we've done, even outside Australia. In fact, I'm working with him now on a project in India. And yeah,
some of those installations that you've been involved in the London Design Festival have been incredible. There was an incredible one this year with the that was over the what was the name of the exhibit that was over
Vert. It was called
yeah,
Vert, yeah, which was a sort
yes.
of urban cooling system, if you like. So that was a red oak glulam structure that sat in London. And it had all these plants growing up it, and it created shade, and there was space to sort of sit underneath and read a book. And of course, we've created these sort of hot spaces in cities. So now we need to cool them down, and using planting and using timber and natural materials is a great way of doing that. So yeah, it's really exciting. And we've also had the opportunity to work with some really, really well-known architects and designers who they actually now want to come to us because they think, well, this is a great opportunity for me to explore something new with a material that perhaps I've never worked with before. So we've had the opportunity to work with some big names in the design world over the years as well. And to actually shape some of the design practices. I mean, there's one particular architect, War Thistleton Architects in London, Andrew War. We've done a lot of projects with him, and he's now really trying to use American hardwoods in structural applications wherever possible, which is just great news.
Yeah, and he's been very vocal in trying to push a timber-centric design principle through and engage with insurers to try to actually improve and build the market for more timber in buildings as well, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
That particular exhibit that you mentioned before, the actual red oak, um, how it appeared, and we covered it with woodcentral.com.au a few weeks ago. Some of those images, and I understand that they were featured in all different publications around the world, were incredible. How the sun, how it has that red oak has that real distinct sun-kissed look. It's a beautiful species of hardwood.
It is a beautiful species, but it has one unfortunate problem, which is the name. And it's called red oak, not because it's red. It's because the leaves turn red in the autumn, or the fall, as it's known in America. And yes, there is a sort of slight pinkish hue to the wood if you put it side by side with white oak. And this has been a big challenge for us. So we've actually run for the last 7 years or so a really targeted campaign to promote red oak all over the world. But it's not red, it just isn't. And especially if you select red oak from the northern states or from the higher altitudes, it's not red at all, and you can get more even color, etc. In terms of its uses, it does everything that white oak does. Everything. It's oak, after all. There's only one thing that it cannot do, and you cannot make wine barrels out of red oak because it has this porosity. So all the liquid will end up on the floor. But everything else it does. And in fact, some of those things it does better than white oak as well. We've actually given red oak to some manufacturers around the world. We did a project with Benchmark in the UK a few years ago where we said, look, here's some red oak, northern red oak, southern red oak, here's some American white oak, here's some European oak. Just work with it, do some tests in the workshop. Nothing scientific or nothing particularly scientific, but just the sort of standard things that you would do with wood in making furniture and joinery, whether it be bending or certain joints or, mortise and tenon, etc., etc. Anyway, they did this project and they were all a bit sort of, well, we don't really like this red oak stuff. We're used to working with white oak and European oak. But by the end of it, they were all genuinely surprised that actually this stuff is amazing. And also, I said in some ways it works better than white oak. It's slightly easier on the tools, easier on the machines, and it often stains better than white oak as well. So actually, red oak really, really offers a fantastic timber species that has many, many potential applications. We've just got a bit stuck on the name. And of course, what we have seen is that some users of red oak around the world have developed other brand names for it, if you like. So they've developed, there's glacial oak we've heard about. And of course, that's a reference to where that particular red oak is coming from. It's coming from the far northern states, the lake states, sort of glacial area of America. But at the end of the day, it's red oak. It's just where it's being sourced from that's making the difference.
And with that glacial oak, it's more blonde in color, isn't it? Then yeah.
It is, and if you were to source red oak from the far south of the United States, get it from Alabama or Louisiana or something, you'd find that because of a much longer and growing season, it's growing much faster. There'll be much more color variation in the wood, and probably the density of the timber will be slightly lower as well. So, if you want a sort of uniformity in color, then yeah, you'll need to go to the far northern states to get it.
The key is that there's so much variation between different areas that it suits so many different purposes, doesn't it?
It does. And also it suits so many different markets. I mean, I do a lot of work in India. And of course, in India, one of the main concerns is price, so when many manufacturers there, particularly export-focused manufacturers, have started to use red oak over the last few years. And they're quite happy to use southern red oak that's, full of all sorts of different color variation and mineral streak and all this sort of thing, as long as it meets the price that they're prepared to pay. And of course, because labor is so much cheaper in a country like India, they're also happier to work around all of the defects in the wood. They've got more people on hand to be able to remove defects, to be able to stain the timber, to be able to work around how it comes. Whereas if you're dealing with a market like Australia, where labor costs are really high, then you want to be able to open that container and pull out the lumber from the container and just stick it straight in the machine without having to really double check it. And just hopefully it's all going to look the same and be great, because you don't want to have to pay for an extra pair of hands and eyes to check it each time.
And I guess that's the miracle of globalization, because between different markets, it has different purposes. It finds a different home.
Absolutely. And it's also very, very important that we use everything that comes out of a log. You have a round log, you're going to be turning it and cutting lumber out of it. The one thing we don't do in America is saw through and through. It's not sort of flat sawn, whereas it would be in Europe. So in America, it's turned and turned and turned. And we end up with multiple grades of lumber coming out of one log. The grade that is required, particularly by a market like Australia, is always a sort of higher grade lumber, which leaves, I don't know, 70, 80% of the log. So we've got to find other uses in other markets for that other grade of lumber. We can't just use only that lot and throw the rest away. And if you are a sawmill or a manufacturer in America, so you're sawing logs, you've got your customer in Australia who's buying this grade of lumber that's coming off your logs, but you've got to have markets for all the rest of it too. So a market like India is really useful, or it could be sort of industrial hardwood uses, could be for pallets, could be for truck decks. So, those sorts of industries are required just to make sure we use everything that comes out of every log out of the forest.
So one of the big topics in Asia Pacific at the moment is around circularity. So is there a degree of a great degree of full circularity with the American hardwood model and how it's reused?
Full circularity is a challenging one. I mean, we've been over the last decade, I suppose, we've been looking at life cycle assessment. So we're looking at the full life cycle of American hardwoods. But actually, it's not really cradle to grave, it's cradle to gate, it's cradle to delivery to you. Then, when we've done these collaborations with designers and architects around the world, particularly in Australia, we've then looked at the life cycle assessment of the actual piece that's being made. So we're taking it beyond the gate through to its full life. So in terms of circularity, yes, wood is wonderful as well because everything that we don't use isn't wasted. It's used for something else. So whether it's sawdust or wood chip or offcuts, etc., we can find a use for it. We can generate electricity from it. We can do all sorts of things. And also the end of life for anything made of timber is great because yes, it's going to rot and decay. Ultimately, it will release CO2 into the atmosphere, or it can be pulped or something else used for something else. But at the end of the day, it's a biodegradable material. It's a natural product. It's not releasing anything particularly harmful back into the atmosphere or into the soil. So it's a good thing. And of course, there's circularity of business as well. So, American hardwoods taken out of the forest in America, produced into kiln-dried lumber in America, then shipped to somewhere like Vietnam. And of course, that's going into furniture back to America as well.
Yes,
so there's that kind of circularity.
It's amazing how that actually works, isn't it? How it is the full circularity of the business concept where you're effectively growing the product, exporting it, importing it again, and it becomes high grade furniture.
It is extraordinary, and sometimes it's difficult to actually fully wrap your head around, but of course it all comes down to labor costs at the end of the day. And also people think, well, hang on, it must be really expensive to be shipping this stuff around the world, but actually it isn't particularly expensive to put a container of lumber together and ship it around the world. What's expensive is the wood inside the container. So yes, I mean, it just makes sense. This is where globalization really does work. I mean, in the UAE, for example, many people don't realize that actually it's a massive center for wood processing, but for wood processing for a really, really huge part of the world. So there are an estimated 300 joinery factories in the United Arab Emirates that are using vast volumes of hardwoods, whether it's from America or Africa or Southeast Asia, which are going into projects all over the Middle East and far beyond the Middle East. And that all comes down to labor, infrastructure, the fact that it's very easy to import containers into Dubai, for example, very easy to export from Dubai. The UK is a great example. The UK, a bit like Australia, doesn't have really big manufacturers left anymore. There are small high-end bespoke workshops and sort of medium-sized manufacturers. But if you're building a big new hotel in London and you want to put all this beautiful hardwood joinery into 150, 200 rooms in the hotel, you're probably not going to be able to find a UK contractor who can do that. So what do? You get it done in Dubai. And that's what happens a lot, so and then you even have people coming with the semi-finished products from Dubai, installing it in London and doing it like that. I mean, it just works.
But it's incredible because we go back to the forest, and because the United States has such strong regulations around their forest management, it provides that full safe protection that you may not actually get in other parts of the world as well. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. What the US doesn't have, though, and this is the hard part, and this is our greatest challenge at the moment, is it doesn't have a tick in the box, that you can easily say, well, American hardwoods, they're great because of this tick in a box. We have masses of wonderful data proving that the wood is both legal and sustainable, and we can get into that. But we can't give you a label saying, here you go. You've satisfied this particular procurement policy. But what we can be assured of is the legality of American hardwoods. So in response to EUTR and the Lacey Act, we actually commissioned an independent study back in 2009. It was called the Seneca Creek Study, where we looked at the risk of illegal wood entering the American hardwood chain, if you like, in America. And the conclusion was that less than 1% of any American hardwoods available on the market could be considered to be illegal in any way. I mean, there's no organized trafficking of illegal timber or anything like that in America. And actually, what we are about to complete in the next few weeks, I understand, is 33 individual state risk assessments. So we've taken that particular study from 2009, which was updated in 2016, I believe. And we've now done the same study, but for individual states, all 33 of the major hardwood producing states. And that information is going to be available very soon. And the reason we've done that is because that's going to plug in to the system that we're developing to satisfy EUDR and to develop the Sustainable Hardwood Coalition as well.
So would those 33 regions be state-based or location-based?
Those are individual states. Every state has its own laws. And what we're going to also then be able to drill down to is to the individual counties within those states where the wood is coming from. What we struggled to do in America is to look at individual ownership or harvesting units, because this is where it gets really difficult. If you imagine you have a sawmill in West Virginia, they don't own any forest. They will be buying logs from up to 200 miles radius from where they're based, from potentially thousands of different forest owners. And those logs all end up being mixed together. And, so it's very, very hard to say, well, this particular log came from this particular plot of land. What we can probably do, and in fact, we will be able to do this very soon, is to say, well, it came from this county within this state. And there's about 1,400 counties within those 33 states that are producing hardwood. So hopefully this is going to be enough to satisfy EUDR, which is actually asking for individual ownership or individual plots of land, which is extremely challenging. Of course, that works very well if you have a plantation, which is huge, and it's under single ownership. It doesn't work in America where you have 10 million private individuals who own the forest.
And that's an important distinction, because those 10 million are local families, for example, that may have a small block of land. It might be agricultural land where they have agroforestry on it.
The most common scenario is that it's a farm, where they're growing whatever they're growing on their farm, or they have animals, have livestock, and then they have a small area of forest as well. And over the generations, they learnt that the value of that forest is incredibly high, so they manage it carefully. But there's very, very interesting. I like to show you this slide when I talk to architects about American hardwoods. There's a study called the National Woodland Owners Survey that's done in the US every few years, and it looks at 13 reasons why individuals look after, maintain, and manage their forest. And it's really interesting to note that production of hardwoods is number 11 out of 13. It's not the number one item. So number one is things like beauty, biodiversity, could be windbreak, shelter, this kind of thing. It's not actually, well, here's some forest. We know that we're going to make a lot of money by harvesting that. It's not that at all. It's people want to keep forest because they really value forest for its beauty and everything else it offers. But they also know that every generation or so, they can bring in some state certified loggers. They can remove a few trees. They go off, they get sold at auction, and they can make some money out of it too.
And it can help the vegetation around it grow and get richer and stronger as well.
Absolutely. And it's incredibly important. And actually, when we talk about the American hardwood forest as well, it depends where you are in the US, but we're not talking about one particular single forest. A lot of it's non-contiguous. So you could fly over areas in the sort of upper Midwest, states like Ohio, etc. And you see what you're looking at is sort of patchwork of farmland, essentially, with little blocks of forest interspersed within it. It's not a great big sort of tract of forest that goes on as far as the eye can see. And that is the case in a few other states. I mean, the state of Pennsylvania, for example, is roughly 70% covered in trees. And I mean, the first time I went to the US was back in '99, actually. And I was absolutely astonished to see the size and scale of the forest. And I'd spent a portion of my childhood growing up in Borneo, so I knew what forest looked like.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I was really, really astounded to see, to see just how huge it is over there. I mean, it really is. And also the fact that it grows back so quickly. Earlier on, I spoke about how, the state of Pennsylvania was deforested and then we left it alone and it grew back. Well, actually, you can walk into mature forested areas in states like Pennsylvania and you can find the remnants of buildings that were there 150 years before. So stone walls and things. And now they're in amongst mature stands of timber, really productive forest.
So
So
I guess the United,
soils in America are excellent for growing trees.
so the United States is a bit unique, isn't it? Because it's almost like it's a perfect environment to have this production of hardwoods, isn't it? Because of the climate, the infrastructure around it, its trade around the world. It's really well positioned to effectively to become almost, as you said, that almost the tree basket
It is.
of the
It
world.
absolutely is. Yeah. And I think one of the things that we're really focused on now with our promotional strategy is actually taking everything back to the forest and what the forest provides, and saying, look, there it is. There's this enormous resource that's enormously productive, and we need to make the best use of it possible. And we're probably not using it enough. Let's focus on that. And this is part of the climate solution as well. I mean, we know that trees will do and will play a really, really important role in maintaining global temperatures, etc., and absorbing CO2. So the American hardwood forest and the American hardwood industry is an integral part of that. And actually, I look at it and think, well, this really is a sort of perfect win-win scenario.
Yeah.
Let's just make sure we keep using it.
Yeah. Rod, thank you very much for your time today. We can't wait to chat to you again in the future, and all the best with AHEC.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a real pleasure. It's been good. Thank you.